Okay, Megan, we're almost at the end of 100 glimpses, and not only, as I've mentioned to so many people before, it's not just the history that you've brought to life; it's the people who have been part of our history.
You mentioned the people, and looking over the list of all the different topics and videos that we've made, the vast majority of them have been about the people. More than a third of them, we've talked about different individuals that have been a part of our history, whether they be clients, founders, board members, staff. And I think that that really says a lot about who we are as an agency.
So, which one? If I said, okay, who made you? Which one made you cry?
Oh, there's so many. Tom Whitaker, though, is on the top of the list. Tom was somebody who was a part of our history for roughly a third of it, for around 35 years or so. He started in the 1930s and he was placed as a job working for the Toledo Blade as a newspaper seller. And just the thought of how he was a part of people's lives. People probably saw him every single day of the week as they bought their newspaper from him and saw all these major headlines of all these major events that occurred in our history. And that was very touching. And seeing his grave, and it had an image of a guide dog on it. And somebody had to do that for him. And it just showed that even up to the end, people cared and he was a part of people's lives.
So, what about I don't know, maybe which memories made you laugh? Like, do you, or any that just like caught you off guard and was just such a, a funny, lighthearted story or
Well,
unexpected?
I know you and I both share one of our favorite stories was there's the friendships that were made in the workshop. The workshop for some people it was a launch pad to other things, and for other people it was a huge social opportunity to work with people who you can relate to. There was a story about these women made a phone booth for one of their coworkers because she was always cold. So they took this giant cardboard box and just like carved little holes and windows in it so she could, still work but have the wind blocked from her.
What puzzle pieces were the most exciting for you to find?
I would sometimes in my office just kind of yelp with joy as I found these things. And one of those situations was when we found one of our sparks, who was a man named Joseph Clunk, who went around to different places and advocated for Society for the Blind. And I'll never forget, it was Valentine's Day. And I was just kind of Google searching his name and like, he's kind of a big deal. And the first thing that popped up was a Smithsonian article. And I'm like, oh, wow, he was a huge advocate and did so much in the 1930s with the Randolph Shepherd Act and finding people jobs. And
Well, and such a big deal that as we went through the whole process, and now we are getting a historical marker, and that of all the people that have been part of our history, there's one name that's mentioned, and that's Joseph Clunk.
it has been the most important thing to me in my professional career is learning and sharing this history. And like you said, some parts of it were very well known but kind of forgotten. Like even Dr. Harry S. Will, our first executive director, comes up from time to time. But it was really the most surprising part was the Lions, about how the Ohio Lions in 1923 took on blind welfare as a cause. And I think the timing was right when Joseph Clunk came to Toledo and talked to Edward Evans and Frank Saxton. That was just, it was meant to be at that moment in time.
And I think that you mentioning Harry Will, I think that's another a wow moment for me to learn that our very first executive secretary, which is, I guess, the equivalent of our today's executive director, um, that the very first one was blind,
Yes,
and he served in that role for what, 3 months was it, and then
yes,
went back to teach
academic.
academics. Yeah, but the fact that our very first executive secretary was blind was something that I had never heard that. I don't know, speaks volumes about what it was like back then.
Not literally one of the first board members, but within the first couple of years, they had their first blind board member, Overton Remy, who was there for decades, actually. This is before term limits. I know it was to Toledo Society for the Blind and not of the blind, but it did have an involvement from early on, which I really think speaks volumes about the organization.
And I think on the naming of the project itself, 100 Glimpses, that was interesting because I remember we were toying around with different different things to call it. And when we landed on glimpses, it's a neat thing because it was pragmatic, and it was pragmatic because we didn't feel handcuffed to like having to tell the complete uh, unabridged history of the Toledo Society for the Blind. It's a little bit of a description of vision impairment. That sometimes you don't get the full picture; you get a glimpse.
I just want to reflect that it is important to, in our society, celebrate disability studies and disability history alongside everything else. And just going through Toledo, and I'm not from Toledo, and learning so much not only about our history, but similar agencies in our field and in the area, but also learning about Toledo. It's important that when we brag and talk about how amazing Toledo is, that we mention that as well.